Hi, welcome to the Emerging Future Institute. My name is Benjamin J Butler. I'm the founder and a futurist. And today I'm joined by my friend Jong Lee in Hong Kong, who has quite an array on his CV as a trained lawyer, businessman, investor, organizes TEDx and a number of other important conferences in Hong Kong. Kind of bridges the United States and Asia in many ways. So excited to have you on, Jong. Thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be on, and thank you for inviting me. It's great to be a part of the conversation.
Awesome, thank you. Well, you know, you're a really interesting nexus in the world. A lot of people go through Hong Kong, but let's just start off in Hong Kong. How are things? What's the energy of the city like now? I remember a few years ago talking to you. You know, shortly after the Umbrella Revolution, Hong Kong had, people might have argued, had started to lose its way. There was conflict with the central government. Some people were relocating to Singapore. How's the energy now?
Yeah, it's a great question, and you know, it's one of those things where we're in the markets every day, and so you know, every time I leave the apartment, you know, in the morning, I kind of put my finger up in the air to see what the winds are like. I would say number one, Hong Kong is busy. You know, as busy as ever. People are going about doing their thing. At the same time, I think people are quite aware that the world around them, the world around Hong Kong is changing rapidly. And in some ways, they're trying to adapt. In some ways, they're trying to keep up. In some ways, they're trying to be responsive. In other ways, I think culturally, Hong Kong has been more of, and you see this a lot in Asian cultures as a stereotype, kind of a fast second, like a second follower. You know, they haven't had a lot of historical success being a pioneer. You know, in their mind, you know, they view, you know, from you to borrow, you know, a phrase or a concept from America, you know, pioneers end up with arrows in their backs. So, you know, they want to be the second guy, and so I think they're very cautiously, attentively observing all the amazing things that are going on, and I think they're just trying to be prepared to be that fast second. You know, as soon as some of the trends become much more clearer, and they're, you know, the risk-adjusted return all of a sudden changes, right? They want to be somewhere else on that curve.
Yeah. Yeah, no, the pioneers and the settlers. A friend of mine in New York always talks about that. I mean, I guess relations with China are a little bit clearer now. It doesn't seem to be. I know there's tension in the background, but it seems like to me that people in Hong Kong are sort of just getting on with business again, or generally speaking.
Yeah, I think it's a really astute observation. I think a couple of things are happening in parallel. Number one, I think both China and Hong Kong realized they need to get back to business because the world, and this is really hard. I'm married. My far better half is a lovely Chinese woman, a Hong Kong Chinese returnee. I'm not. I'm Korean, and so, you know, as an outsider, quote unquote, you know, this whole concept of China not being the center of everything is still a really hard thing to get, you know, for Chinese to get their arms around. But in reality, what they see right now is they're 1.3 billion in a 7.5 billion person community, and that a very large portion of that world is actually moving on, whether they like it or not. And so I think China is very, very clear. If you look at, you know, how important they know it is to be able to export their RMB, right, to be able to finance their future, how important it is for them to pull as much in so that they can be globally competitive in the future, so that they avoid the future ZTE, you know, issues like we're seeing now. At the same time, Hong Kong realizes that 20 years ago, I mean, really all you could say about Hong Kong was it was the gateway to China. That pitch has dramatically changed, even with our government friends here in West Hong Kong and whatnot. Sure, Hong Kong, no one's going to deny China is massively important to Hong Kong, but you know, as you see the growth in Asia regionally, you know, actually kind of dumbbelling, right? You're seeing just dramatic advances in productivity and leapfrogging in terms of automation and robotics in Japan, led by guys like SoftBank, and that cultural comfort level. I mean, unbelievably, just, ground floor comfort among Japanese forever. Ever since I was a kid, with robots being our friends as opposed to robots being our enemies, right? They're okay with everything, right? And they need it. To just there are twice as many young people in India as in China, and they don't have the same sort of structural issues. And there's, again, more young people in Southeast Asia than China, and they're just going like gangbusters. I think everyone's aware of that. So from Hong Kong's perspective, they know their mission is to just get along with business because they have to really stay relevant on a regional and on a global basis. And that, I think, just arguing and fighting just with China has not been maybe the smartest move for them. At least not anymore.
Yeah, my hope for Hong Kong, given the legal structures and financial services and everything, and I know people complain that the level of English has diminished over time, but my hope was it was always going to be a regional, I guess, regional global city, if that makes sense, rather than just being another Chinese city that happens to be international. And my sense is that there's that possibility, as like fintech seems to be taking off in Hong Kong. I was pleasantly surprised about the size of that conference Rise and others in Hong Kong that seem to be not just about China.
Sure, and so I mean, if we think back in context again, China, I mean, Hong Kong has been the home for some of the world's largest trade shows for decades. It's just 20, 30 years ago, the most important trade show was not fintech or tech, but the Hong Kong Electronics Fair, right? And then that spawned the big one in Canton and the other one in Asia World Expo. But it was trading, right? People came here. This is, I still believe Hong Kong is one of the world's greatest marketplaces, or one of the biggest bazaars, right? People come and they gather and they look at things. And I think one of Hong Kong's greatest cornerstones of intellectual property that's actually not something that you can just steal is this whole trader's mentality. I mean, you've lived here, and that Hong Kong's famous for their outdoor markets, these wet markets where they have these chickens hanging in the booths, and it's just a commodity volume play. But there's a trader's talent and a nose. They know they're not producing anything, but they're going and making an efficient market and making their margin, and that is actually very valuable intellectual property. And you see that evolve in the trade shows and now in these tech shows and conferences. So I see that as a very healthy, natural evolution of something that Hong Kong is good at. I think from the perspective of, will Hong Kong, continue to be a very vibrant and important financial hub? I think the big question for me is how we define financial hub, and what the layers are, and what the current changes mean for these layers. Give you a case in point. When I think of a money center, financial hub, there are three that are legitimately a money center, and then a couple of halvesies, right? So you've got London, New York, and Hong Kong. Of the three, only one city has cash. Hong Kong has piles and piles and piles of cash. It's a very liquid market. New York and London have piles and piles and piles of paper, right? And that's fundamentally different. You got tier 2 guys like Singapore and Tokyo, blah, blah, whatever. But now if you peel that back, number one, I think with what you're seeing here in terms of fintech and technology changing, literally transforming things that are traditionally viewed as assets into liabilities, and it's not just happening in Hong Kong. For example, having a lot of cash is a liability, which is why interest rates are negative in Europe, right? It just doesn't help you, and there's nowhere to park it. This whole trend towards market efficiencies and rationalization severely punishing passive investors, who aren't proactive about where they put their money, as reflected in negative interest rates, because inflation is relatively is stable, right? Number two, and so that's not so helpful to have all this cash in Hong Kong. Number two, why does a city want to be a financial hub? You know, and it's not really the tip of the spear investor, the banker, managing director from, you know, wherever, you know, from the best schools and the best experience. It's the structurally grossly overcompensating nature of those finance companies in terms of their compensation for the middle office and the back office. Okay, so you know, as you probably remember in your banking and finance days, the middle office, back office, the administrative support, these kinds of folks, you know, if there's a great local Hong Kong person, right? Because those are the kind of jobs that are filled by locals, whether we're talking London, New York, or Hong Kong, or wherever. A great lady, a great guy working in the back office, doing such and such. If that person's working for Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, such and such, right? They'll probably be making, you know, two to four times more, you know, what that skill set would pay outside of that industry in Hong Kong, right? And what you're seeing first is if you go from that middle office or back office from Morgan Stanley to the Bank of China, which is a Chinese bank, boom, you know, your compensation is not going to be the same, period. It may be more stable, right? And it's more of a kind of maybe an administrator's job, but it's not, you know, if that pay goes down, where does the debenture come from, right? Where does the cash come from for that investment in the second apartment, right? Where does the cash come from for, you know, private tuition? All of these expenses that, you know, keep the economy growing and moving. Similarly, in New York City, if you think about how many way overpaying middle and back office jobs the financial industry creates, that's and then the income taxes and the economic benefits of those kinds of slushy jobs, that was gold. But if you look at where fintech is, what it's doing to the middle and back office, you know, already in terms of, you know, the REITs that do the strip mall retail banks in the United States, right? As all of those things become automated, less about real estate, less about physically being there, and much more efficient and far more value and secure for the consumer and for the government and for the depositor because fewer people are involved. That middle and back office is just being wiped out because just like Tesla's battery factory, right? Human beings in that process will slow and gunk everything up, right? There are no lights in the production factory because the things move so fast, 10 times faster than would be literally humanly possible. So if Hong Kong wants to become a massive fintech hub, that doesn't mean that what that means could be super good and successful for Hong Kong, but that might mean that the nature and the definition of where deposits are and what that is completely changes because it's completely distributed, especially with blockchain and individualized accounts. Number two, those great middle and back office jobs are all gone. You know, they will completely disappear. You know, if you have blockchain and you blockchain your accounting, right? Accounting becomes a real-time exercise, which means it's really a part of finance and it's completely transparent, which means you just have you have to publish an API that your government and regulators plug into. There is no compliance officer, which means there's no opportunity for abuse, right? I mean, it's just one of these really weird paradoxical things. So in terms of fintech, for sure, you know, Hong Kong says they very much want to be a player in fintech. I don't know if the city of Hong Kong is really aware of what those implications are, and how do you substitute? How do you preserve that sort of wealth creation?
Yeah, good points. But I mean, perhaps because the global nature of financial markets, you'll find got a little bit now. Persevere. Because the global nature of financial markets, a lot of these big banks will end up using, if it's not a fintech company in Hong Kong, they might well use technologies out of London or New York or San Francisco that replace jobs anyway. So I guess the mentality would be just to get on board and deal with the.
There's no good choice, but let's still be in the game. Is your point, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I completely agree. But you know, but the nature of what that means. So, for example, when you say the technology is from Hong Kong or from New York, you know, and if you look at or from Silicon Valley, you know, some of these shops, maybe the owner or the company is incorporated somewhere in the United States or Delaware, but like all of the developers are somewhere else, for example. You know, I mean, the nature of the business and the way you do the business is completely distributed for so many of these companies. You know, and I therefore I would imagine the risk profile. How does a major bank or a major economic unit, right, manage risk? You know, in this world where just 5 or 10 years ago, people were thinking about, okay, where is the physical server that we can seize, right? You know, and now there's no such thing as a physical server because everything is in the cloud. I mean, it's just really, really hard. And there is an answer, but you know, we're having to reassess so many of our fundamental assumptions, you know. And so definitely if the choice is between not being in the game at all and being shut out and playing no matter what that means, yeah, I think definitely the latter is what what Hong Kong has decided to do, which I think is the right choice. But the tension is, you know, how do we stay? How does Hong Kong stay there? How do we kind of be a player while not making any proactive moves other than saying we're fintech? You know, Hong Kong is a great city, but it is not, I would say, technologically advanced. It's not a truly, it's a wonderfully free market, but a not so wonderfully competitive market, if you know what I mean. You know, things are they're not super efficient in terms of pricing, but very competitive. Everyone moves very fast. Everyone's very ambitious. So in terms of technology adoption from the consumer on up, you know, it's one of these curses of having been super successful with prior generation technology and business models. You know, I mean, the German companies are going through the same reality, having to embrace the knowledge that the future is quite different, but they've just been so unbelievably successful in the past, right? There is no DNA left in their existing chromosomal makeup to make that jump. And so, you know, they're desperately hiring consultant after consultant trying to figure out, well, what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? They know, but they don't know. And so, yeah, it's exciting. I mean, things are changing just constantly. But at the end of the day, you know, Hong Kong is still a free port.
Yeah. How do you think, so a lot of people probably in the US and the UK won't understand these dynamics, but so Hong Kong isn't necessarily a technology leader. How about its partnership with the, I guess, Silicon Valley of Beijing and also across the border? Because again, I mean, a lot of my friends in the West won't have even heard of the Greater Bay Area. You know, that term kind of appeared in the last couple of years, which essentially is what we used to call the Pearl River Delta area. That's you know, all the technologies of the Guangzhou and Shenzhen area combining with Hong Kong, combining with I guess Zhuhai.
Sure.
Do you think that's gonna work?
Yeah, you know, there is undoubtedly a lot of tech and a lot of you know, new economy progress. I mean, it's unbelievable the pace of it and the breadth of of technological progress in Greater China. I wish I could say that Hong Kong has been a great beneficiary, you know, of being so close to all of that. But from what I see, and I think this is the right rational decision by the key players in China. China is a brutal, tough, competitive market, and they know, if you look at the solutions, you see what they're good at in general as a stereotype and what they're not good at. They are quote unquote advanced. If you define advanced as very big, you know, and very broad, and you know, and financial, has huge numbers. In terms of how sophisticated and how powerful the technology is, in terms of how good is the tech, you know, I think you're going to see a very, very wide gap. I'll give you a case in point that's not specifically fintech. Anybody that wants to mass market using, you know, pay to click, you know, AdWords, you know, in China, the Chinese version of Google is Baidu, right? Anyone who's actually, you know, and it's such small money. You know, a lot of people have this experience. anyone's actually done campaigns in Google AdWords will be shocked, will be just unbelievably, mind-numbingly shocked at how much worse, right? Just how clunky and inefficient and manually driven Baidu's version of Google AdWords is. It doesn't mean that Baidu is not massive. It doesn't mean Baidu is not super successful. It doesn't mean Baidu isn't powerful, and it kind of works the same way. But when you actually use the tools, there's just no question. If you look at how efficient, how well things are done, whether it's just the interface or how well the product is thought through, I think the rational assessment awareness in China is it's a monopoly, and the biggest guys in China need to really focus on surviving and winning China first and foremost. After they win China, then they can worry about the rest of the world. So whether it's facial recognition technology for fintech, whether it's, consumer financing, whether it's settlements or blockchain, most of the really, really great Chinese tech companies that I'm familiar with are almost 100% focused on China, because they know unless they're number one, they're likely dead. It's a really brutal binary, all or nothing, and they know that they have to put all their eggs and have got to raise a ton of money to win China. And without that, there's nothing. And so that's number one. Number two, if you're in China, your top 10 markets, to be able to do this, especially under this monopoly, right, under this kind of protectionist, they get to play inside China without having to deal with Western competitors. They don't get that benefit in Hong Kong. Right? Hong Kong is an open market where you use Google and all these other tools. They don't have that benefit. They don't have the support and the effective protection from the home country, and they have to face. That's why Baidu Hong Kong is nothing in terms of the ad driver. Why would you use that here in Hong Kong? It's just a terrible tool if you had a choice, right? So then you have third, the cultural thing. If mainland Chinese don't view Hong Kong Chinese as the same thing, and the same with Taiwanese. If you're a Hong Kong born Chinese, yeah, you might think you're great. You're Hong Kong, you probably are great. But if you go to Beijing, you will know and feel definitely you're not Chinese, as far as the mainland is concerned. And they speak a different language, right? Hong Kong is still very dominantly a Cantonese speaking language, and the written version is traditional Chinese here. It is not simplified Chinese. And so, you have these things. I think undoubtedly the fact that HSBC is strong here and HSBC is strong there, undoubtedly because there are so many mainland Chinese that are in Hong Kong or that are interested in Hong Kong, those are all great. Those are all wonderful and good for Hong Kong relative to, let's say, Tokyo, Seoul, or Singapore. But in terms of fintech and to be able to really benefit, the way I would think, that, let's say, Shanghai or Guangzhou benefits from being in Beijing or something like that, or Ningbo, that hasn't happened yet. It may change. It may change. And Hong Kong's continuing to maybe dovetail, and things start to get closer and closer as the 50-year window, marches forward. But also at the same time, you're seeing so much fintech leapfrogging, those countries or jurisdictions without a lot of legacy infrastructure. Okay, so like India, it's 100 years old. Everything they do is just so bad. It's so bloated, but it's so bad they don't even think about building on it. That would be stupid. It's just like, India's going to be one of these, and Africa could be one of these really great places where their first really fat bandwidth is 5G. And because they have no wireline, they have no fiber, everything is wireless, which means they skipped, right, 60 years worth of headaches and learning and incrementally growing. You're going to start seeing the same thing happening. Well, you're already seeing the same thing happening, in China, with things like WeChat Pay, but even more so in terms of banking, actual core fintech. Okay, in India, because none of the traditional systems work hardly at all. Think about blockchain applications for centralized filing for your real estate, real property, your titles. In the West, it's been so established and so efficient that there's a clerk's office. You go to the clerk's office and you see the piece of paper, right? And then the evolutionary is next step where they scanned everything so you can see those pieces of paper online. This doesn't work in many places. In Hong Kong, it's as embarrassing as this is to say, as a lawyer and that who is involved in real estate, every time a piece of property is transferred from one party to another in Hong Kong, a human being still has to manually go through the entire stack of titles and deeds and transfer documents, okay, for that piece of real property. And they're literally looking at one at a time. I mean, like a forensic investigator, right? None of this is electronic. It's shocking to the senses that sort of thing is done manually, you know, but that is the state of things. And if you think about that times one, you know, 100 times bigger, i.e. India, and it's not even that organized, they're not even going to try to build. They're just going to jump. And, you know, India is super freewheeling, right? They're just, everyone will try whatever. So it's exciting. So I don't know, but Hong Kong is, from that perspective, not in China, so they get to play a little bit there as well.
All right. Well, I want to move on to, I guess, some of the bigger forces you've already alluded to. You said something rather, I guess, heretical earlier.
One thing? My goodness, I'm doing okay.
Yeah, no, keep at it. You know, that's what our job is to sort of try and think the unthinkable. And you mentioned the world moving on in regard to China, or I guess you evoked the image that perhaps China isn't the center of the world. You know, I remember when Trump got into well, the year Trump was going to come into office. So, well, that was a year ago. And the guest of honor at Davos World Economic Forum was Xi Jinping. And the Western media, or a big chunk of the Western media, was fawning over China as now replacing the dying American empire. And I've not agreed with necessarily that very simplistic assessment of the world, and I know in the past you haven't. What's your view about this?
Sure, that's a great question. So I think, number one, if you look at the trends in technology and how that's impacting how people are living and what people have to do to live, one trend you're seeing that I don't think is going to go in reverse is a re-onshoring and a drastically shortening of supply chains, right? The most important thing is 10x more so than 10 years ago. Where is the customer and how close can we be to the customer? Second most thing is, how do you avoid risk? How do you avoid balance sheet risk? And how do you avoid balance sheet risk multiplied by time, which is a huge problem if you have very long supply chains. And so what you see, and the evidence you see manifesting in this trend towards a shortening and a re-onshoring of everything, and more that matters, is the year-over-year 1 to 2% decline in cargo shipments, right? First, you see technology. I mean, the first kind of the obvious waves were, you know, when I was growing up, I had 6 or 7 pieces of electronic appliances, and they were big. You had a television, you had a stereo, you had this. We all have one. It's a smartphone, and it takes up this much space, right? Number two, we would have other devices like hard disks and things like that we stored things locally. Again, they're all gone. We don't have to buy that box. On a bigger scale, you know, between automation and, you know, the rise and the closing of the most egregious labor value gaps, you know, it's labor arbitrage, right? Because China is not a cheap place to do things anymore, not even close. You've already seen over the past 10 years a massive shift in big bulky things like white goods and auto parts, right? Dryers, washers, refrigerators move, you know, for American customers all to that maquiladora border, you know, in Mexico, right? Mexico has gone through a 10-year manufacturing boom cycle that was what China had 20, 30 years ago, you know, and all of those, none of those things are coming from China. Now you see things that are even more advanced, whether it's, you know, custom made, the high-end Adidas shoes, right, that are actually 3D printed and manufactured one at a time in Germany, you know, or in Eastern Europe. Or again, the Tesla Gigafactory, where these batteries are flying around so fast, and they know, because these guys aren't dumb, that it's actually much, if people are not involved in the manufacturing, it's actually much more expensive to make it in China at the nominal level. And then if you calculate the additional costs from the risk of a long supply chain, balance your risk because it's all the way over there, and you've got to wait weeks and weeks and weeks for it to get to your distribution center and then further out. The cost of buying a gigafactory battery pack from China, you know, or a Tesla product from China, as far as Tesla is concerned, was between 15 and 40% higher, you know, which just blows your entire business model. And so, you know, we're just seeing the beginning of this, right? You're seeing more and more automation, and China getting more and more expensive, and the cheap labor, whatever is left in cheap labor, already leaving China. At the same time, China is a net importer of water, food, energy, you know, all that stuff, right? If more and more regions like South America, because of technology and because of increasing critical mass, or North America or South Asia, you know, start to benefit from this trend towards re-onshoring, people have to ask, you know, are we already in a post-China era? You know, is there truly anything that we really, really need from China? And being here in Hong Kong and being married to a wonderful Chinese wife and loving so many things about it, it's kind of a scary question. But if you go through the list of things, do we really need anything from China? You know, I think the orthodoxy, you know, as you're explaining, as you mentioned in your question, was, you know, this is China's era. So it's very paradoxical. You know, do we really need anything right now? Right now, and I think China really understands that, which is why they're so aggressively desperate to make sure that the Intels of the future, right, that the Boeings of the future are all Chinese, in which case you need China, right? Which is why it's not surprising, and depending on how North Korea and these other things go, you may see Huawei also being sanctioned. So all of a sudden, no Qualcomm, no Intel, no nothing, which is still possible now, but maybe not in 10 years. And if that doesn't work, then I just can't imagine SoftBank and the Japanese saying no to the United States because of the sanctions that they clearly violated with respect to North Korea and Iran. You have to terminate your ARM licenses. Think about what that means, because ARM is it's a British company owned by the Japanese, a Korean who is a Japanese citizen, right? SoftBank and Masayoshi Son, right? The entirety of the small world, this kind of stuff, right, is powered by ARM. If they terminate an ARM license, that's an even more profound death knell, right? Because everything that all the chips that Huawei makes, all the chips that Samsung makes, the Xenios chips, those are all based on the ARM licenses. So, you know, China is very aware, obviously, of this, you know, and I think they know, unless they become the United States in terms of you have to buy these things from us. Yeah, I mean, that's a kind of a crazy prospect, and we're not talking about, you know, this question becoming front page news 30 years from now. People this is the whisper conversation that's been going on for a couple of years. Scary, you know, scary. But exciting.
What's your and I don't disagree with a lot of, you know, I've had many conversations, and I think China clearly is going to continue to be an important place in the world, but it's such a massive oversimplification by many of the journalists about the sort of decline of the US, and it's typical for, I guess, a lot of analytical people that just draw straight lines of extrapolation, and unlike business people and hopefully futurists who think in cycles and try and look round corners. But what's your assessment of the US now? Do you think a renaissance is happening, or is possible? You know, you talk to certain quarters in America, some friends in California on the coast. Some of those demographics are incredibly pessimistic about the US. You look at the echo chambers continue on social media. There's still a lot of friction. I mean, there's a whole litany of problems. The gap between the rich and the poor. You know, it goes on, and we've got obviously an election cycle. We also have obviously at some point, 2020, Trump will have to face re-election, and if the business cycle, which cannot continue forever, at some point will have to turn, presumably going into a recession, American society could polarize further, but yet there's so many green shoots as well. What's your assessment?
So I maybe even with my even taking my US hat off, right? I think if just looking at it objectively, there are some really exciting things happening, and the whole world is seeing it. A lot of the coverage you see, it really stems from people who they just don't like seeing the United States. What's frustrating for the world seeing the United States over time is they tend to do, we Americans tend to do really dumb or arrogant or naive things, and they make dumb mistakes, and they leave too much on the table, or they're too generous, they're too blah, blah, blah. And they somehow wind themselves into a corner where if you follow that line, no question, they're going to blow up. They're done. Yet every 20 years or so, these guys, someone gets pissed off or upset and reinvents something and says, okay, it's over, we're doing it again. And you see this again every 20 years. There's always this kind of this recurring cycle of economic, intellectual, and capitalist renaissance. And every time they come back from the brink, it's like a Hollywood movie, right? And it's like, why can't they die, right? One of these things. And some really interesting things are happening. And what you're seeing and some of the things you're mentioning are really the birthing pains, which truly have to be so painful, right? That you've got to give birth to this next thing. And so what am I super optimistic about right now? Number one, there is a massive amount of reorientation away in terms of power from the Monday morning quarterback bureaucrat who's never done anything good in his or her life. Right? It was just a massive tax on humanity, right? Which Europe is still resisting, right? Back to the Monday morning quarterback who actually has to show up, throw that pass, and make sure it gets caught. And even if that pass is perfect and his receiver drops it, he's still the quarterback. It's his fault. To really, really understand and better align the rewards to those who are actually on the field and scoring and taking those leadership positions, which is never popular, which is always controversial. Whether you were Abraham Lincoln trying to free the slaves, he barely won his re-election, right? This, or Churchill in England, during the war, right? You always get mamby-pambies who say, yeah. Never do anything helpful, but it'll always be there to criticize you, right? To monopolize power to do nothing. So you're seeing a massive shift. I can tell you in places like the northern area of Los Angeles, where we have a very meaningful presence. There are hundreds of thousands of homes being approved. Massive infrastructure improvements that have been held up by nuisance lawsuits, by this bureaucracy, which has destroyed certain things that I think from a smart energy perspective, like renewable energy, like the French have done, like actually super safe nuclear energy. It takes 10 years to get anything approved, not for good reasons, but for just dumb reasons. There are real estate development projects, 5,000, 10,000, 20,000 homes that have been held for 10 to 15 years, one nuisance suit after another, blah, 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 hearing after hearing after hearing. And every year the carry cost is millions of dollars. These projects now are actually being greenlit. And we know because the number of out-of-state construction workers that are focused on the infrastructure part, the roads, the power, the pipes. There's so many in the area, and that's massive because these are 10, 20-year investments. So once these things go in, you're going to see it. Number two, you're starting to see the difference between a Facebook employee and a Facebook founder. Okay, and I mean that in terms, it's not just Peter Thiel. If you look at the Jeff Bezos of the world, the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world, the Warren Buffetts of the world, and the Peter Thiels of the world, one of the things you notice is these people, even if they're companies, are maybe in cities and have lots of employees that may have certain political leanings, if you look at their eyes, they're all clearly either diagnosed or undiagnosed Asperger's kinds of guys. Super brilliant, right? But because they're in that, okay, because they're in the spectrum. I don't know if you've ever seen that Warren Buffett documentary. You know, every 15, 20 minutes or so, the producer, the director asks an uncomfortable question, you know, and Warren Buffett just kind of says, I don't want to answer that question. He kind of looks into the camera and you see nothing there. I mean, this guy is classic undiagnosed Asperger's. And the reason why that's important, I'm not getting too far off on a tangent, I hope, is one of the classic symptoms of spectrum people is they struggle with human empathy, which is why you see nothing in the eyes, right? They have a certain pathology, right? Like psychopathology, right? Where they're just a lot of autistic kids. They're having to be trained to be human because they just don't feel it on the inside. And why is that important? It was very rational to be a successful .com person in San Francisco, to be aligned politically in a certain way, to guarantee the only thing that really mattered, that gave them their disproportionate success, by ensuring that their legacy competitors remained heavily regulated, the atom companies. And that's what this whole net neutrality con job is, right? They just wanted to make sure they paid the right side, voted with the right side, said whatever it took to make sure that they remained highly unregulated while their competitors and their incumbents were super regulated, right? That's worked so well that all the richest companies in America are tech companies. So great. I mean, they didn't do anything illegal. God bless them, you know, but they've wiped out everybody. I mean, this net neutrality con is such a silly talk because Google could buy all of them. It just doesn't matter. They just choose not to because it's so overregulated. They've done such a good job making sure that this lie called net neutrality has resulted in all roads, no matter what form of broadband you have, leading to a singular content monopoly. They own the layer 7 monopoly. There's already a de facto cartel monopoly here. So it doesn't matter which route you go to, whether it's Cox or AT&T or Verizon, you always are going to end up at Facebook or Google. So they've won. So now that they've wiped everybody out, the Asperger's owners now understand that there's only 3 massive piles of inefficiency left in the American economy, where they can actually go in, make a big difference, and then become the next $10 trillion, to be the first, not trillion, but $10 trillion company. But those 3 are controlled by the same political party that they've been funding for 20 years. And that's a big problem, right? If you look at the power base and the labor union base, it's not the private sector, it's the public sector and the quasi-public sector in education, healthcare, and government services. Look at where .com investment is going right now. They're all starting to poke into highly regulated industries, highly regulated endeavors, and it's kind of hard to say that American education is good value or even works when the functional literacy rate for the average American, you know, when only 30% of graduating 12th graders are functionally literate, right? It's humiliating when you consider the United States spends $13,000 per child, you know, for public schools every year. That's just fraud. That's just fraud. Healthcare, you know, the value that Americans get for the dollar, again, is just fraud, right? So when you start seeing, and this is not just speculation, right? This is why these trinities start forming to move massively. Amazon, right? Berkshire Hathaway, JP Morgan announced a healthcare alliance. Why? Well, you've got Geico, right? You've got Amazon customers and one of the too big to fail financial institutions. Right? They've got all the pieces to reinvent it initially for themselves, and then their existing customers, the Geico insurance policyholders, the millions and millions and millions and millions of online Amazon customers, and the millions and millions and millions and millions of JP Morgan customers. They've got all 3 pieces. If they wanted to, and if, for example, the US government, like they did with marijuana, said, you know what? Gray market importation of prescription drugs is so pervasive. We're just not we're going to let our US attorneys in each market determine whether they're going to be prosecuted or not. So it's de facto legal. Players like that group, I can see them offering a new economy health insurance policy within 2 years. That's 50% less than current market product. That's actually 50% better, you know, better in terms of the actual service levels and benefits and health outcomes, that comes at the expense of some massive, massive incumbents, right? If you eliminate the need for most of the radiologists, okay, all of the easy, fat, lucrative jobs that people all want when they graduate medical school, right? Right, radiologists, ophthalmologists, dermatologists, anesthesiologists. Think about how that impacts even things like immigration, right? All of these really wonderful, high-skilled, right, doctors and nurses and whatnot. How does that impact that? How does it impact the employment curve, even for domestic, for the domestic labor pool? How does it impact those cities where they've really staked their 100-year career on being a major healthcare hub? Who needs the hub? Just like if you in a fintech world, who needs a financial hub, right? Same in education. It's not by coincidence that a vast, unbelievably high disproportionate percentage of white Anglo-Saxon male college students in Ivy League schools or the most competitive schools are homeschooled. Okay? If they're homeschooled, by definition, it's distributed education and largely accredited online curricula, right? If that's the proof in the pudding, and I picked that point out because if you're a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant male, you don't have any victim or special status to get into the most competitive schools. You've either got to kill it and you got to be a unique candidate, or you just don't have a chance of getting in, right? For those candidates, 5x, 10x representation versus the population pool. But what that's telling you is this whole notion, the world, because the tech guys no longer need to feed that animal, it's in their interest now to take those set government subsidized dollars, like in charter schools, we'll pay this much money no matter how much it costs you. And because the current performance is so bad, they could not do a work. I don't think it's possible for homeschool, charter schools, or tech guys to do a worse job, right? Think about another one of these pillars that are just clinging on for dear life, but they know it's over. The city of New Orleans, after Hurricane Katrina, and it sometimes takes these terrible things like that to really reveal how the king has no clothes. The hurricane exposed just how unbelievably genocidal the school system was in New Orleans, cities predominantly African-American children. And if you're an African-American male, you can't read. I don't care whether you're in America or elsewhere, your future is not looking great. That despite the controversy and despite the fact that only one party controls that city, as of January 1st, 2017, 100% of the schools, the publicly funded schools in New Orleans were charter schools. There was not a single traditional public school left in the city of New Orleans, which is shocking. And if it can happen there, boy, you better watch out, right? And think of the repercussions. If unions don't control public schools, then big, massive pension funds like CalPERS start suddenly running out of cash really fast, right? Because these are really most of these things are so underfunded, they're more like pay-it-forward Ponzi schemes, like Social Security, right? There aren't any funds really being saved to fully fund these pension obligations because they're defined benefit, not defined contribution, right? So one of the largest traditional forms of passive institutional, not my money, right? Investment capital, pension funds, public pension funds. If schools and hospitals, nurses and doctors and educators all of a sudden have to be like us, take some risk, add some value or go away, 401k or the highway, right? These pools are gone, right? So what does that mean in terms of, if you're a private equity fund or a venture fund, blah, 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 right? I mean, it's massive, but there's so much money there. And this is just like the government in healthcare. They're saying, we'll pay this much money. And it's so grossly inefficient. You're seeing so much movement towards ed tech because they know the government will pay you this much money, even if it only costs you this much to provide a better educational outcome. But what does that mean? It's not like that party is stupid. They're super smart. But they now realize that there's only 2 gladiators left in the Colosseum in Rome, and now they're facing each other, which is why you're starting to see a massive fracture and fissure from Northern California to Southern California. right? You're seeing this very interesting merger of very socially conservative people like Dennis Prager or Ben Shapiro, Dave Rubin, right? He used to be with the Young Turks. Really kind of converge with guys like Peter Thiel, who are very, very Silicon Valley originally, but again, also very libertarian. And so here you've got a pot, right? Very, very tech, very outward-minded, lots of people, a lot of folks from the LGBTQ community and Orthodox Jews, but they're all coalescing, and it looks like the beginnings of this very cool third way and yet another reinvention, right? Again, this next 20-year cycle where it's no longer about what made Silicon Valley work up there, right? And it's going to take this, and I'm really, really confident that things are so bad in California. Look at the homelessness numbers, right? Hundreds of thousands of Americans are actually the stupid things that the government's done to itself. Just having a dumb drug policy, for example, right? And paying so much money to make sure that kids are completely illiterate and not functional, which is why you have to import educated labor, right? All self-inflicted genocide, right? Because anyway, the problems are so bad. The same dynamics that elected our 45th president, I think you're going to start seeing, right, change things in places like California. And if California goes in that direction towards this more sober libertarian, what's the actual deal? I'm tired of the con. That is a massive, massive seismic shift that actually I think could pay dividends for that next 20-year cycle boom. If you unlock the cash flow and restore the productivity, right, from actually providing great value in education by getting rid of the people that are destroying it, getting great value in healthcare, completely streamlined and automated government services, very much like some of these smaller, like not real country, little country economies like New Zealand. Everything is online, which is amazing, right? Everything's just done, and it works because it's online. Think of the impact, positive impact, net of those job transitions, because unemployment is so low in terms of American GDP, right? It's really kind of crazy exciting. I mean, there's still 95 million working age people that are not working in the United States. So the unemployment percentage is, that's just one part of the thing. There's 90+ million working age people that are not working in America. So, it's going to be very interesting. The great impact and the big concern for China is they were counting on America growing at 1 to 2% for the foreseeable future, which means in 10 years, the American economy would probably have gotten to 23, 24 trillion. At a 4 to 5% clip compounded over 10 years, the American economy hits 30 trillion, which means that over the next 10 years, because of China's fundamentals, like their population peaking, because people don't move to China, right? It has to be it's domestic growth, right? And production. China will hit their GDP peak and hit their population peak and rapidly start declining, right? Without actually surpassing the United States in terms of economic might. That is really, really scary, especially because all the authors, all the smart people, all the analysts that you were mentioning earlier simply couldn't foresee that as a possibility. There's just no way. How can any outcome happen or be other than China being the dominant? But we saw this in Japan. Remember the 70s and 80s, right? Everybody thought Japan was going to surpass the United States. And if certain things didn't turn out the way they did, they probably should have or would have. A U.S. economy of 4 or 5% driven by these fundamental deep infrastructure, deep long-term investments, paid for by rationalizing terrible things, these hidden taxes that have been cancers on American productivity and the economy. Not every dollar of GDP is the same. Otherwise, if you had an entire economy running on growing opium, for example, and everyone's a taker and not a producer, maybe for a few years you can say your GDP is great, but in the long term, you're done. There's nothing left. You're basically, you're eating yourself. So I think that this next tech revolution will be outside of Silicon Valley. There's a tremendous amount of things happening in Southern California. There's a ton of reinvention in Texas. they're just going gangbusters. You know, the largest, Texas produces more solar energy than any other state in the world, in the United States, and no federal subsidies. They just get everything done, you know. The Midwest continues to be very impressive. We have to see what the dynamic pushback is between what's left of Illinois and this kind of back and forth excitement in Michigan. But, you know, the progress there is just exciting, you know, just breathtaking. And just like I was mentioning about the what the reality is and what the implications are in terms of high paying local jobs, right, where the alternatives are 1/3 the pay. If fintech accelerates and it impacts New York and London more, you're going to see the political sentiments of New York City and the state of New York change like that. Once the good money, once the easy money is gone, people behave very, very differently. In the United States, I think there's enough of a real economy where that actually brings everything back towards even more stuff. You know, it's not a surprise that Berkshire Hathaway bought Flying J. I don't know if you're familiar with that. Flying J is America's largest truck stop chain. Okay, which is just genius because they already own CSX, the railways, right? If you envision a future just in a few years where trucks don't need drivers, by definition, if you've got a very successful truck stop, that means that you're in a very good intersection or a hub or a transit way, which means every single Flying J location could be a major Swiss-like logistics hub, right? Where you have Amazon or Costco size warehouses and logistics centers for everybody, you know, and that's a big bet on, again, this trend of re-onshoring everything back into the United States. You know, I always try to pay attention to the people that are a lot smarter than me and have a lot more money than me. And I think, you know, as I mentioned, there's no question you know, Berkshire Hathaway has been making bets that suggest what I was mentioning earlier in this talk to totally be true, that the trend is towards onshoring, and the trend is towards more and more things being done within the borders of each major economy. So it doesn't have to be a country, but each major economic bloc. In this case, let's say the NAFTA bloc in North America. And so they purchased not too long ago Flying J, which is by far America's largest truck stop chain, which means by definition, those lucrative locations are and great locations for trade and commerce in these commerce hubs and intersections. And if you just look at a few years, which I'm sure they did, because so many of their businesses will be impacted by automation and autonomous driving, like Geico car insurance, right? They envision a future where trucks will have no drivers, but because those locations are so strategic, I think they're envisioning massive logistics hubs in every single location where there's a Flying J. You rip out the gas station, the gas petrol pumps, you rip out the trucker's lounge because both aren't necessary. It's all electric, right? And it's just massive warehouses, right? Because everything is being re-onshored, right? And it's going to be vital for those locations, and that function will be 10 times, 100 times more important 20 years from now than they are right now, where it's just ports in Long Beach, in San Francisco and whatnot, bringing things in from abroad. And so, you know, that wasn't even a $10 billion deal. You know, it's unbelievable how smart that acquisition was. But that completely is consistent with what we're talking about in terms of these trends. And as an economy as large as the United States that doesn't need water from anybody else, that has a surplus of energy, food, water, guns, talent, right? Hard currency, all of these things. If there's an economy like that where they're actually able to do more for itself by re-onshoring, by reactivating a reserve labor force of 90+ million people who are working and who are not working, right? How do you not bet long so long as you keep the Monday morning quarterback from ruining everything? And that's what you're seeing, you know, for better or for worse, you're seeing it. You know, even states like Connecticut, they just can't deny anymore that almost all of their budget increases and all their budget cuts are going to pay for pension costs. It has nothing to do with making sure that the citizen, you know, is actually the boss, right? They're still saying citizens work as slaves for the slave masters, which is the civil servant corps.
Mm.
So, that's going to be the tension, and which is why people know it's life or death. So it's very noisy. It's very violent. Okay. It's frantic, and it's like, yeah, it's like an air war. It's like the battle for Britain, because the stakes are so massive. But there's no doubt, if you look at the trends, what is happening, and how the forces and former allies are now turning into adversaries, and former adversaries are turning into allies, and how this whole traditional notion of left, right, Republican, Democrat, I'm gay, so I have to be this, or I'm Asian because I have to be that. It's all completely being tossed up, and people are very uncomfortable and they're scared, which is why they react this way in a very noisy, maybe oftentimes unproductive, oftentimes irrational, hissy fit way. That's to be expected.
Yeah, yeah. No, very, very wise words. And well, I'd love to have you on again. There's so much more we could talk, particularly about both China and the US. A lot of people are going to watch this video and at occasional moments think we're heartless capitalists, and that's definitely not the case. Jong's involved in some incredible things on the NGO and charity front, and to rejuvenate the heart and soul of the United States. And we can talk about the environment, this, that, and the other. And I think so many people are sort of caught up in the cult of personalities of people like Donald Trump, etc. But I think you're right. One of the big trends out there, and Nassim Taleb, the very smart author, and I guess finance / statistical guru, for want of a better word. His last book is about attacking the academic, or the I don't want to say non-productive members of society, but I guess he thinks that the producers have somewhat lost power in society, and that's swinging back. And
so
and I don't exactly, and I don't think you and I we're not about, when we talk about some of these trends, we're not for empowering large corporations. We just want a functional capitalist democratic system where the mum and pop stores come back, the SMEs flourish, and where the average man and woman on the street can flourish again. And yeah, there's
one of the really exciting things that I also see happening, if technology moves in this direction, is this exposure of the great lie that is minimum basic income. Right? If we talk in terms of minimum basic income, that's just guaranteeing that those big companies and all the political people in power now get to retain it, because now you've just cemented in that subscription to what they already control. If you allow technology to move the way it's going to move, where it seems to be moving, the cost of food, shelter, and education and healthcare should just nosedive. Right? When technology reduces the cost of R&D for cures, when it reduces the investment, the dollar investment to make sure everyone's literate and a productive member of a civilized society, of a free market society, when you need fewer and fewer human man hours to provide, again, parasitic taxing services like government services, and instead focusing on being a productive tip of the spear member of the economy, your costs should plummet, which means you were looking at the potential of more like a Star Trek universe where everything's free. And if everything's free, then what's the point of arguing about a minimum basic income? That's exciting. And what does that do? And these small towns, these individuals where you're the small guy, all of a sudden you're not having to make just terrible choices, where you just don't have enough money. All of a sudden the question of, am I a 1%er or am I a 10%er? Wage income disparities, when everything is this, when you can get high quality everything for this, right? It promises an amazing renaissance in a redefined democratization. It completely reinvented egalitarianism, that actually, should mean so many good things, for places like the United States, where you still have a bit of a dynamic and peaceful political transition. Whereas, some of the other developing markets where they're still ruled by force and a monopoly on physical violence, those in power are unwilling to sometimes give that up and go away quietly in the night. But when you see these tech trends where technology can dramatically reduce costs and therefore indirect taxes, that's very good for the little guy. That's very, very good for the small guy. That's very good for the minority. That's very, very, very good for every person who feels they're in some sort of niche something or another, because they're empowered by not being taxed and not being picked apart.
Well, it's great to talk to you about both technology investment and a very human future, which is a big focus for Emerging Future Institute. So thank you so much for your time, Jong. Always inspiring and enlightening talking to you, and I hope we can do this again.
Sounds good. Thanks so much, Benjamin, and we'll looking forward to the next session. Take care.